Who is the most baddest person you've ever met? I knew a guy once. He was leaving his house to go to work, and a crackhead rode up on a bike and tried to mug him. He punched the guy in the face, took his bike, and then rode it to work where he welded all day. I grew a full beard just from hearing that story. My uncle is the only survivor of the squad he commanded in Afghanistan. Not a single one of them died in combat, but everyone except for him killed themselves after returning home. He wasn't functional in public spaces for years after the fact due to PTSD, and his wife couldn't take the stress and divorced him. The fact that he's still alive is a miracle. The fact that he's happily married, perfectly functional in public, and makes unreasonably good money etching barrels is just a testament to the dude's willpower. A guy who fought in the 1956 Hungarian uprising. He fled Hungary as a teenager and ended up a mercenary in Africa and Asia for 20 years. He migrated to New Zealand and worked a lot of the same jobs as my dad. Had more scars and bullet holes in him than I thought possible. I had gone on a rock climbing trip with a group of about 15-20 people to Red Rocks over the new year, and were out at different crags every day through the area. There were a lot of climbers and other groups in general, but there was this one older man, in his 70s early 80s I would guess, that I saw every single day just hiking through and watching people climb wherever he went. He seemed very quiet, but still kept good pace and you could tell he was spry. I kept noticing him the first, second, and third days. We would always pass him at some point, no matter what area we went to. He felt like a Red Rocks spirit to me, always doing his rounds and always watching, but never being paid attention to, just witnessing. The next time I had seen him was at the top of this crag a couple days later, and I was taking a break from any climbing. I decided to wander up to him and watch the same group of climbers as him. Turns out he came from Germany a long while back as a boy and came to the area when rock climbing was beginning to take off. We started chatting about the beta and moves that this one girl had to complete to get up this 5.12b, not an easy route, and he was able to predict perfectly the sequence of moves she was going to do, and in about 4 moves, fall because of a very specific hold and body position on the route. The girl followed his guess perfectly. He continued to do the same for every group climbing around us, including my own friends on the wall. He knew every intimate part of every route that he could visibly see. I had to ask how he knew everything about all the climbs, and he told me to bring him my guidebook. He proceeded to flip through page after page and say, "Yup, that's me. First ascent. Me. That too. My friends did these ones." I inadvertently had sparked a conversation with one of the original climbers of the area, who literally wrote the book on it. He told me about how he stopped climbing after all him and his friends had been associated with the book and info, and after someone had gotten injured, they had sued his friend group and essentially ruined his life for a long time and took the sport from him. Since then almost all of his original climbing friends had passed, and so he spends every day of his retired life out in the rocks when possible just watching people climb his original routes. We are going back to Red Rocks again this New Year's and I really hope I get the chance to run into this legend again. My grandma. She only had one hand, lost most of her arm in a car accident when she was in her teens. This woman could tie a squirming toddler's shoelaces, trap, skin, process rabbits into a delicious stew to feed the family, and generally run a household of 10 people with one hand. Not a person, but this ginger cat that wandered down our drive one day, one eye missing, what seemed like half of his brain exposed, gashes everywhere, just skin and bones. We fixed him up and named him Butters. He guarded our house with his life and would take on any dog, coyote, anything that tried to come up. He once fell asleep on a visitor's car and clung for dear life a couple miles down the road until our friend realized he had this chunky ass cat sprawled out like a starfish on his back window. His name was Remington Strongman. Badass in name only. Client at my restaurant. Was just a skinny 20-something. Credit card checked out however as far as his name was concerned. Harold. I met him when he was in his 90s. He married my widowed aunt. In WWII, he was a B-17 pilot and his plane was shot up terribly in a bombing run over France. He and his co-pilot kept the plane in the air and allowed his crew to bail out. Then he and the co-pilot went to bail out. Harold said when the co-pilot got in the door to jump, he froze. In Harold's words, I kicked him in the ass so hard he fell out and then pulled his chute. Harold laughed and said, I got a medal for saving him, but the thing is, that plane was completely on fire and I wanted out of there, and he was in my way, because Harold was the last man out of the plane. Just as he deployed his parachute, the plane exploded. Harold was knocked unconscious and though he survives the landing, he was injured with broken bones. All the rest of his crew got to safety with Allied troops, but Harold was captured by the Germans and held as a POW until the war ended. I think he qualifies, but my father, several of his brothers and several of my mom's brothers all served in combat in WWII. They were all over the world and they all came home. They were pretty badass as well. Plus they killed Nazis. My mom, when she was in her early 20s, she got bucked out of a moving vehicle and had severe brain damage. She was supposed to be dead within 48 hours. And when she lived, they said she'd be a vegetable for the rest of her life. Instead, she woke up, relearned how to walk, talk, read, and function, and walked out of the hospital on her own. I was a mistake that she raised on her own without complaints. She raised me alone, went to school, got into nursing, and weaseled her way out of the projects into an honest-to-God house, without child support for the bulk of my childhood. I can honestly say that I had an amazing childhood, and she never once made me feel like a burden. I have never seen her back down from anything, ever. Somebody trying to break in? Well, they ain't gonna get far. Ex-boyfriend threaten her daughter? Bitch, she dares you to open that gate. Boss lowballs her and then has the gall to call her lazy? Have fun. Because she can be put to better use elsewhere. She's now fighting ovarian cancer with a very low chance of surviving. And her response to talking to hospices? I will never talk to them. I'm not done. She was offended they gave up on her. She's in a bad place now, but she's lasted way longer than they anticipated and has even been improving. She just kind of shrugs it off. In her mind, she doesn't have to relearn what English is. So, you know, this should be easy. I wish I was half the woman she is. My grandma. She broke her neck in a car accident driving in a rural road in winter. The car went into the ditch, and unfortunately no one was around for ages, and night was coming soon. So, she managed to climb out, and for quite a distance to the nearest house. This was decades ago, and now she's almost 90, and despite chronic pain, she's traveled the world, and lives on her own still. My dad. He served in Vietnam as a Marine, was discharged with a Purple Heart, then joined the Navy, and became a flight surgeon. He could fly F-18s, and perform surgery, not at the same time. After his military career, he became an emergency room surgeon, always saving lives. He passed in 2013 due to dementia, and left us way too young. He's my absolute hero and hands down the most baddest person I've ever met. I once met this girl who was my age, 15 at the time, and competed nationally in swimming. No big deal. Except she lost a foot and hand to a flesh-eating disease. She was so sweet and humble about her wins. My uncle. He was killed in Vietnam in 1966. He enlisted because he hoped it would keep somebody else from being drafted. I grew up looking at the box of medals they sent home with his body. He saved his squad by jumping on top of a grenade that was thrown at them. Dad has been gone for almost 30 years now. I remember working in the garage with him one day. He was working on a V8 engine block on the bench and needed to move it to the other end of the bench. He grabbed it with two arms and started to the other end of the bench. The block slipped out of his grasp and landed on his foot. He did not flinch. He picked it up and placed it on the bench and kept working. At the time I was 6'4" and 235 lbs. I knew then I was never going to mess with him. I was on a trip with a group of friends in Alaska, and we met an Austrian guy who looked and spoke like a young Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was several months deep in a solo canoe and overland trip across gates of the Arctic National Park. Can't think of a number one right now, but met a guy during a summer activity who lived in the mountains upstate, worked as a lumberjack in the logging season, and tuned pianos in the interval. I feel like I met a lot of badasses when I worked at Apple. Shocking, I know, but we weren't all nerds. but Don was by far the most badass. When I left he was 82 years old and sharp as a tack. He kept up with the breakneck pace of the genius bar appointments with the best of us. He lived on a mountain, and every morning he'd run to the summit. He climbed Mount Baldy at 79 without breaking a sweat. He was a classically trained opera singer, an orchestra conductor, and a music professor at a local college. He spoke fluent German and Spanish. I think he went to seminary school at some point too. He was definitely a pastor at his church. He was all around an incredible guy with an awesome life story. I might never work with anyone like him again. Had this thing at school, where I met an old man. This was back in early 2000s. I was talking to a group of people like most 16-year-olds do. I talked about how school sucked, and it's hard to compete with everyone. Old man tells me to count my lucky stars for my opportunity. I kind of blow it off. 30 minutes later I'm in the auditorium to hear a guest speaker. The old man gets on stage and tells his story. His name was Walter Wiener, and he was a Polish Holocaust survivor. When he was my age he was held in Buchenwald. He told several stories about how he had planned to charge the gates so they would kill him. A couple about being in line to be executed and feeling relieved. After he told his story I realized uncomfortably exactly what he meant when he said I should count my lucky stars for the opportunity. He was badass because he was ready to die from the pressure he was under, but chose to keep going. He pushed through, and on the other side of that tragedy, he had a family at home and a life of constant gratitude. I came back from a deployment and got out of the military. I lost a big part of my identity and was in a deep depression. When it got down to the darkest points I thought about Walter and how happy he was. I thought of all the people I know that would qualify. Veterans, firemen, police officers. But I don't think any are as badass as my cousin. She is a normal woman, head of her own accounting firm. But that woman must have angered a god at some point in her youth. And she has punched back everything that God threw at her. Lost her dad to cancer at 14. Discovered young she was barren. Adopted two kids of a different country and skin color. Raised them both to become smart, sensitive, successful people. Suffered a massive stroke in her 30s. Survived. Was fully paralyzed 4 years. Recovered at 99%. Had 2 heart attacks in her 40s. Survived both. Despite all this she is still the most positive, caring, and loveliest person ever. Always fought like hell to survive and raise her kids. I want her by my side in a zombie apocalypse. Also I never complain when I get sick, because she never did. Guy was a Navy SEAL. There was a book about him. Dove and removed mines. Endless stories of badassness. Lost an eye. Gave me a crash course in scuba. Had no tolerance for pussies. My dad, till the day he passed away from cancer, served in both the Israeli and Russian army, obviously different time periods. Moved to the United States with my mom to start a new life with my family for the rest of his life. For 35 years in the US, and everything about him was badass. I had these bullies in high school who picked on me, private all boys school, and they just wouldn't stop, and the teachers and no one else did nothing about it either. And one day instead of my mom picking me up from school, my dad picked me up. He saw that I was upset, and I broke down crying, because I couldn't take the torment I was taking from these bullies anymore. So my dad asked where they were, and I pointed outside the car and he yelled for their names and I don't know what he said to them. He didn't hit them obviously, but it was enough to have them stop picking on me for the rest of high school. My dad was my hero, that day and forever, and that exudes such a level of badass and respect from me that day. My dad was tough and strong till the day he passed away. I'll never forget how strong he was even on his deathbed. But he left such an impact on my life that no other person ever could. That's why he was so badass to me. My mom. She grew up in China with her parents and sister living in basically one room. She had to attend night school, where everyone told her she would never make it to college. She did and went on to win awards as an architect. She then married my father and moved to the States, where she worked years as a waitress while my dad went to school. Then my dad was killed by a wasted driver. She had 6 months to be remarried, or we had to leave America. She decided she wanted to stay here for me. Because by then my Chinese lacked very badly. I moved here when I was 5. Somehow she found an amazing man who knew our situation and helped us in every bit he could. Then my stepdad got diagnosed with a disease called PSP, where basically he slowly loses every single function he has. These days my mom spends her time turning him in bed every 2 hours to avoid pressure sores, feeding him through his feeding tube, cleaning his incontinence, giving him daily bed baths, all with as much love as the first time they met. She also works a full-time job as an AutoCAD designer while maintaining an amazing backyard garden, while also keeping up with her own gallery and art. She gets around 4/5 hours of sleep every single night. Yet somehow every time I see her she has a huge smile on her face and is very energetic and cheerful. I don't know how she does it, but she gives me hope to be an amazing person as she is. Guy fought with the Polish underground during WWII, went on the toughest deals, got captured 3 times and sent to prison camp, escaped 3 times, got captured again just before the liberation, killed one of the guards and put on the guard's uniform because the Russians were liberating the Polish prisoners and the British were taking charge of the German guards. Later gets it sorted out that he's Polish and would have been killed if left to the Russians. Gets sent to London and emigrates to US. Trained as a nurse. He was the most unprepossessing tough guy ever, but he was a tough guy. Glad I knew him. I met the guy who was the first person to ever travel across the entire continental US on horseback. He didn't even set out to be the first person to do it. He just went out and did it because he wanted to, and was shocked to find out later that no one had ever done it before. When he also found out that no one had ever traveled from the Canada to Mexico borders on horseback, he set out and did that too. My dad. He can do anything he sets his mind to. He's 5'8" and 140 pounds, but can lift anything. Built our family house, fixed cars, coached my hockey teams growing up, worked in drug trafficking, then child 30 digital forensics. All that, and he's still proud of the lump of a son I am. If I can amount to half the man my father is, I'll have done alright. I once met Christopher Lee. I've been thinking about this question all day, so I had to post it. Anyways, I'd say the most badass person I ever met was this absolute mad lad German guy in Namibia. My friends and I booked a desert tour of the Namib with him. He picked us up in a WWII German ambulance and rolled us on over to the desert. He decided he wanted to show us a snake. This guy slows down the ambulance, leaves it running, and doesn't even put it in park, and just jumps the frick out and sticks his whole hand into a bush, but doesn't find the snake. He did this a few more times before he just pulled out a freaking pit VIP and shows it to us. Then proceeds to tell us never stick your hand in a bush. He then started driving up and down the sand dunes, not giving a frick. I swear we were at one point going down at a 90-degree angle. The guy was slightly nuts, but I had a lot of fun and learned a lot from him. My grandmother. She wrecked a riding lawnmower down a 20-foot ditch at 80 and pulled herself out with one arm. She still has a bad arm from it. Roughly 10 years later she accidentally set her 1-acre yard on fire and she beat the fire out with a wet dish towel before the fire department got there, with one good arm. Eater. She was 80 years old. Not doing 80, might be. Bruce Campbell. He fought an army of demons. So that's pretty badass and groovy. Me, I can do a somersault with my eyes closed. I once watched Junior so defuse a situation where a wasted dude just wouldn't stop badgering this girl in his crew. Dude wasn't handsy or anything, just kept following them around, constantly inserting himself into their fun, and all the while just constantly hitting on this lady. Junior finally stood up from the blackjack table, cracked his neck, picked the dude up by the belt and the scruff of his neck, carried him 10 feet away, and said something to him quietly before setting him down. Junior went back to playing blackjack and dude bugged right the frick off. Annoying dude was actually pretty big. Junior picked him up like a toddler. My uncle Woody, big Native American, fought with the 164th North Dakota National Guard Infantry on Guadalcanal in WW 2nd, sent to reinforce the 1st Marine Division. At first the seasoned Marines had their doubts about them, but after the Japanese were defeated at Guadalcanal, they referred to them as the 164th Marines. He was wounded and decorated for his actions there. After WW2nd he volunteered for active duty in the Korean War. Again, he was decorated and wounded, receiving the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was said to be fearless and fierce in battle. He was known to the enemy and believed by some Chinese soldiers to be a demon who could not be killed. I only knew him years later, retired, disabled, a gentle giant who loved home and family and simple pleasures like a good cup of coffee or a good meal. He loved to visit friends and relatives and was known by everyone in the community. At reunions of the vets of the 164th, grown men would burst into tears upon seeing him, telling his wife and family they would not be alive except for Woody. The safest place to be was right next to Woody. It was an honor to have known him. True badass. David Goggins, a guy with a messed up childhood who became Navy SEAL and ultra marathon runner. Baddest motherfucker I've met, and a very sweet guy. My girlfriend's sister went through a ton of miscarriages, and after about 6 years of trying she just brought a huge and healthy baby girl into this world. Late first wife, never weighed more than 120 pounds, wasn't possessed of anything remotely like fear. Cancer did her in, but under her terms. The day she decided to die, she did. Badass. There should be a picture of her next to badass in the dictionary. My grandpa. He worked in coal mines at 9. Married my grandma knowing her brothers wanted to kill him for it. Took care of a family of 11. He was 4'11" from growth retardation from working in coal mines. And in his 6 he could lift a 200 or 300 pound rock himself and carry it across a lawn. He had black lung disease and still lived into his 90s. He was a tough little guy. My friend from grade school and high school turned into a very impressive soldier. He's in the Air Force and has been decorated for helping some Afghan commandos out of a bad situation. Physically, he's the most intimidating person I can imagine. He looks like a super soldier. Otherwise, he's one of the nicest guys with a great sense of humor. Probably my ex-fiancée. She knew 6 languages. Sambo, Russian form of martial arts. Was a great cook. Bounty hunter. Unlicensed private investigator. Stripper. Could take a taser like no one's business. Could shoot. Knife fight. Helped take down a small human trafficking ring. A dog fighting ring. And rescued a small girl from a kidnapping. There was a couple of other things here and there, but these were the most impressive. My cousin Christopher was born with autism, didn't speak a word till he was 6 years old, and was developmentally delayed all through his education. However, he has always been a kind soul, and most people recognize that in him. With a lot of support and life experience, he learned by brute force the social rules most of us are blessed to learn as children and teens only by experience. He went from not being able to talk to graduating high school at 20, and he now takes care of himself and also photographs weddings for money on the side. He's very talented. Most people who meet him can't even tell his condition because he's so talented with conversation. And if he slips up and says something awkward, he'll respond, "I'm very sorry, I have autism. Did I say something that made you uncomfortable?" Just an all-around genuine dude who was dealt a bad hand and made the most out of it. Love that guy. My grandmother. She fought cancer 6 different times over 17 years. Through it all, she took care of 5 grandchildren, attended almost every game and graduation, kept a beautifully tended garden, and kept the whole family together. But to me, the most baddest part of it all is in all that time she never once complained or showed fear. As her doctor told her her liver was failing during her 6th fight, she looked at him and said, "Well, I'll just have to get better then." She is the inspiration for my life, and I hope I face the challenges in my life with half the courage she had. We lost her in January this year. I miss her every day, but I'm confident in saying I had the privilege to be raised by one of the strongest and most graceful women in history. My father escaped from communism so he could pursue an education in America. Thanks, Dad. I know a guy who sucked peen for bus fare and then walked home. I don't know if they were badass, but 2 brothers I went to school with fled Iran in the 80s on foot to get asylum in the USA. They did this around age 13, and it took them months of hiking and sneaking around to get to a safe place to finally get to the US. Maybe not badass in the tradition sense. but mad props to them for braving it and pulling it off. Keanu Reeves. Worked with him for 6 weeks. Stand up dude. Pretty badass. Me. I'm frequently the subject of r/I am Veribitus. My dad. When he was 12. My grandpa used to go up north fishing for a week at a time and leave him in charge of the family farm. No instructions. Just get it all done. The milking. The carving. The deliveries. Everything. When he was 22. He was a sergeant in the army. Guarding nuclear warheads in the DMZ. He was in charge of sending his men on missions. He knew some of them wouldn't come back. When he was 30. He was managing a service station in a black ghetto. In the worst neighborhood in one of the worst cities in the US. My dad is white and 5 feet 7 inches. Yet he never had any trouble from customers or employees that he couldn't handle. When he was 35. He decided that he didn't want to be a mechanic for the rest of his life and went back to college. He was working and going to college full time. In the 1980s online classes weren't an option. So he was commuting to school an hour and a half one way 3 days a week. He started teaching while he was in grad school. When he was 40, he had his master's degree. When he was 45, he was a full-time professor of math and economics at a small college. Along the way, he survived cancer, put his beloved, sick dog out of its misery himself, and taught basic math at an open admission school in one of the poorest, most violent cities in America. Some of his students could not divide by zero. My dad did not choose to manage a farm or guard nuclear warheads. And he didn't even really choose to manage a gas station. He struggled to find a job after the army and took the first one he could. I say he is a badass because the biggest choice he did make the choice to quit his job, start college again, and pull a 180-degree career shift was not one many people make. And it took a lot of courage. My dad is now 70 and retired and gets up at 5:30 every morning and chops wood for fun. My grandfather. Born in 46. In 66 he dodged the draft by joining the airborne. In the war he was a mobile helicopter mechanic, meaning he was sent behind enemy line to fix a helicopter whenever it crashed or had issues. He also sighted in guns, explains why he's the best shot I know. He has a Purple Heart, but he won't say what from. After the war he was a ranch hand in Montana. In 1980 he moved to Washington and built a log home by himself from the logs he cut. He then got into forestry and is one of the best foresters around. Has worked in Canada, New Zealand, Chile and half the states. At 72, he has survived 3 major heart attacks and cardiac arrests, and yet he still works full time in the woods. Best story from him was when he stood off to a standing mother grizzly bear in Alaska. Edit. He also looks like a stereotypical older lumberjack. My husband. He can open cans with knives, make knives, do welding things and building things. Just lots of outdoorsy type knowledge and it's incredibly cool. Camping is like dual survival with him. Also spent time in prison, so his ramen skills are on point. Harold Bartz. Met him when I was in elementary school, when we'd go up to the nursing home. He told us very in-depth stories of World War II, like being one of 4 in his battalion that survived D-Day and punching a doctor when he tried amputating his leg. I didn't recognize it at the time, but he really opened up to us. I really wished he would have been around a little longer to tell us more about himself.